Hello, and welcome to HHH, the podcast where we talk about those horrible humans in history. I am your host, Angela Pearson, and I know what you're thinking. I know you're like, where were you last week? What the heck happened? I have the same question. It's fine. I am back, and I am sorry to have abandoned you guys. Life got a little crazy last week, so I had to prioritize some other things over the podcast, but don't worry. I am doing 2 episodes for you this week. You are welcome. I know you missed me so much and you just couldn't wait to hear from me. So we will be doing 2 episodes this week. I'll tell you more about the second episode at the end of this episode. But today, I want to send a special thank you to Holly for the recommendation of our horrible human in history today. Holly recommended this person, and if you guys ever have someone that you would like to hear about, please let me know. I am very happy to talk about any suggestions or any people that you specifically want to hear about. So thanks, Holly, for that. And we today are going to be talking about one of the most infamous kings that literally everybody should know about, or at least have heard of. And this man, I will tell you, fun fact about him, he literally had a man, and people fought for this position. A man was there specifically to wipe his after he went to the bathroom, and people fought for that position. That's how much power this man had. And if you think that's bad, this man had between 57 to 72,000 people executed during his reign. Not to mention, there's a whole story about all of his wives. So you've probably heard it before. You've probably heard the song, divorced, beheaded, died. Divorced, beheaded, survived. So I bet you could guess who we're talking about today. We're talking about good old Henry VIII. Henry VIII had a pretty crazy life. And again, this is going to be one of those stories where at first you're like, this is not a horrible human in history. What are you talking about? Just hold on. His story gets crazy fast. So there's a lot of information about him out there. So that's part of the reason it took me a little longer to do this episode, is because I had to sort through and really find what was most important for you guys to know. So there's a ton of information out there. So again, sorry this episode's a little late, but I wanted to make sure you got the best story. So let's dive in to the most interesting parts of Henry VIII's life. Here we go. Henry VIII, I am. Henry VIII was born June 28th, 1491 in Greenwich Palace in England. That's just outside of London. Greenwich Palace was one of his favorite places in the world, so I'm probably going to mention it a couple times. But his father was King Henry VII, the first king from the House of Tudor, and the last king that had actually won the throne in the field of battle instead of just inheriting it based off of his genetics. He took the crown away from King Richard II at the Battle of Bosworth Field. This was the Battle of the War of the Roses, which sounds like such a pleasant thing, like the Battle of the Roses. But if you know anything about British history, there were a couple houses that were represented by different roses. That's what this battle was, the Battle of the Roses. So it's not as pleasant as it sounds, but I still like it. Anyways, King Henry's mother was Elizabeth of York, and ironically, she was the niece of King Richard III. So, her husband killed King Richard II, but her dad was King Richard III. It's fine. It's all fine. His parents had a very happy and successful marriage, even though their marriage was originally a political tool. Like I said, I've mentioned this in other previous episodes, that marriage back in the ye old gooden days wasn't so much romantic or lovey-dovey. It was more political moves, and that was totally the case for King Henry's parents. It was definitely a political move, but they were very happily married and madly in love with each other. So it was great for them. And it actually really helped heal a rift between their two families. They had been warring with each other. They actually had 7 children. Henry VIII was their second son. So that actually meant that Henry was not going to be the heir to the throne, and that role actually fell to his oldest brother, Arthur. Wouldn't that have been great? King Arthur. But anyways, Arthur, his older brother, received a lot of special training, and it was very rigid and very specific. Because he was going to be the heir to the throne, he had to learn very, very specific things. Henry, on the other hand, was trained in many, many different things, like rhetoric, history, philosophy, logic, arithmetic, geometry, and multiple languages. Like, he spoke French, Spanish, Italian, Latin, and Greek. I've tried to learn French and I can't get that, and he spoke all of those languages. And his favorite topics were actually astronomy, navigation, and cartography. So he really wanted to become a sailor and learn how to sail ships and that kind of thing. And this would be more obvious later in life, when he actually became really interested in naval expansion and naval wars and those kinds of things. But that's spoilers. He's not going to be the king at this point in history. Out of all the many tutors and teachers, the person who actually taught him to write was actually his own mother. So he actually had a ton of tutors and everything, but his favorite was his mom. She taught him how to write, and they actually knew that because they wrote a specific letter the exact same way. That's how they knew that she was the one to teach him how to write. So not only did he really like his studies, but he was actually an excellent musician, and he was very athletic and loved to compose his own music and loved to joust with friends. In fact, his favorite musical instrument, ironically, it's something that is totally made fun of nowadays. It was the recorder. His favorite musical instrument was the recorder, and I think, if I remember right, he owned like 80 different recorders, and he would compose music on his recorder and like go to parties and show off playing his recorder. So just kind of fun fact that he really liked recorders specifically, but he could play other musical instruments as well. But his favorite sport was jousting. He liked all the knightly sports, like sword fighting and those kinds of things, but jousting was his absolute favorite, and he absolutely loved to joust his friends. So he's very athletic, and his studies also included a lot of religious studies. He was a very, very devout Catholic and very loyal to the Pope. Keep that in mind. He was very, very loyal to the Pope. And because he was not the heir to the throne, Henry was actually raised by his mother and was surrounded by his 3 sisters, Margaret, Mary, and Elizabeth, at the palace in Ethelm. I can't say that. And he was spoiled by his grandmother as well. And it was very, very rare that he had any contact with his brother Arthur, because Arthur was so focused on training to become the next heir to the throne. So all growing up, he was surrounded by adoring women who just thought he was the bee's knees and let him know that. And some scholars actually believe it was this atmosphere that made him grow up to be such a romantic and crave women's attention, which I kind of support that theory because he always wanted the attention of women and wanted them to just glow about him because that's kind of what he was raised in, is that kind of atmosphere. Now, Henry VIII was actually pretty popular among his teachers, and even the common people really liked him. He was very charismatic. He was super intelligent. He had a lot of confidence, and he was very, very charming. So he was liked by almost everyone who knew him. If we were actually to compare him, like when I was reading about him, what I kept thinking is I would compare him to someone that would be like a jock nowadays in high school that everybody loved, except he was a nice jock that everybody liked because he was nice to everybody and included everybody. That's kind of what I would compare him to, is he was very athletic, very outgoing, very confident, very intelligent. Now, in 1502, something incredibly shocking and very, very unexpected happened. Arthur died. Sorry I gave you spoilers, but if you don't know that King Henry became the king, then you should open a history book? I don't know. Anyways, so Arthur passed away. They think he actually died of either tuberculosis or the quote-unquote sweating sickness. What is the sweating sickness, you may ask? Well, it was a mysterious disease that historians think was either anthrax, influenza, or hantavirus. So any of those really deadly diseases. But whatever caused Arthur's sudden death, this left the throne to Henry. Henry had not been training to become the heir to the throne. And within that same exact year, Henry's mother actually passed away of what was called, quote, childbed fever or perpetual fever. She had just given birth to a child, and it was a little girl who only lived 8 days, and she passed away because of childbirth. So Henry's suddenly going to become the king when his father passes away, which his father's still alive at this point, but he also lost his beloved mother. He was devastated at the loss of his mother and with the loss of his father. He was quickly forced to take on the training and become the heir to the throne. And his father actually started taking an active role in his training as well. Before that point, he basically ignored Henry, like pretended like, oh, I don't have any other sons. Arthur is my only son. Well, now, he was glad he had another son. So, his father, like I said, had basically ignored him up until this point. And now that he was the heir to the throne, his father showered him with attention. Well, Henry didn't really like this. The biggest conflict between these two actually came because his father, I was about to say the king, his father told Henry that he was no longer allowed to participate in the sports he loved, especially jousting. I mean, I can't imagine why. It's not like it's super dangerous and he could die and then leave them without an heir, something like that. But how dare his father do that? But Henry was not having it. He was not happy about it and really pushed back against his father, but ultimately had to follow what his father wanted. He also shared most of the views of the people, and his father felt more like a landlord than a king to the people, and Henry kind of supported that idea that he wasn't a really great ruler, and he was not very popular with the people because he was seen as super cheap. He wouldn't spend money on anything. He was seen as tyrannical and could never actually escape that title of usurper because, like I said, he had taken his throne in battle, and the nobility just could not accept him as the rightful king. And side note, I do want to point out that because his father was so stingy and so tight-fisted with the finances, because he needed to rebuild them after the Rose Wars, they were basically broke. So he was very, very stingy. Because of this, Henry would inherit a huge fortune. So Henry should have actually been super grateful that his dad was super stingy, but he was not. So he should have been grateful because he got a massive fortune from his father. Oh, and don't worry, Henry would end up spending it all. So spoiler alert. Anyways, on April 21st, 1509, Henry VII actually passed away. So Henry's father would die. And immediately following his death, Henry VIII was declared to be the king. All the people were ecstatic. They were so excited for this change because everyone, like I said, everyone loved Henry and thought he was just going to be such a better king. And his father was now gone, and they were so happy because now they had this kid who had such a sunny personality and attracted people and is super intelligent and confident. He was now taking the throne. Now, they had this man. They described him as very tall, athletic, handsome. He was a redhead, and they believed that they were going to be entering the golden age of prosperity with this new king. Henry's old-time mentor, Fred Thomas More, wrote, "This day is the beginning of our freedom, the end of sadness, the source of joy. This day consecrates a young man who is worthy not merely to govern a single people, but singly to rule the world." Yeah. Now, make note of Thomas More. He will be a part of our story a little later, just so you know. So they were singing his praises. They were so excited because everyone just loved him. And so it seems this is what happened. You know, they entered this golden age. Everyone was happy forever after. And just kidding. If you've ever listened to any of my episodes, you know this is not the case and something bad's going to happen at some point. So just hang in there. So before we continue in our story, I do need to mention something super important that I left out. Before Arthur had died, he had actually been married to a woman named Catherine of Aragon. I don't know if that name rings any bells, but you'll see why it does in a minute. Anyways, so he was married to Catherine of Aragon, and Catherine of Aragon would marry Henry VIII. So after Arthur died, Henry was actually forced to marry his widow, Catherine, because it had created such a needed alliance with Spain. Spain at this time was a really big world superpower. But interestingly enough, Henry was actually deeply, deeply in love with Catherine. And he married the 17-year-old Catherine of Aragon 3 weeks after his father's death. Oh, did I mention she's 6 years older than Henry? Yeah, left that out too. So there you go. So that was robbing the cradle a little bit on Catherine's part. But they were madly in love with each other. So this was a really good match for him, and he was head over heels for Catherine, and she also really adored him. So 2 weeks after their wedding, on the 24th of June, 1509, Henry and Catherine were crowned King and Queen of England in the Westminster Abbey. 2 days after the wedding, there was still feasting and armored tournaments following their wedding day. So for days after, people were celebrating and so excited and doing armed tournaments, which Henry loves. It's his favorite thing. So the first years of Henry's marriage and his reign were actually super happy ones. The people loved having him as king, and he and his wife were madly in love with each other. Like, think of this next part. Have you ever seen the movie A Knight's Tale? If not, we can't be friends anymore, so you should go watch it. Just kidding. But no, seriously, it's a really good movie with Heath Ledger. Gotta see it. Anyways, if you have seen that movie, remember there's a part where the lady that he is falling for gives him her handkerchief as a favor, and he wears it while he's jousting. Well, now, Henry, now that his father was dead, had started jousting again, and his sweet wife always gave him a favor, like a handkerchief or something, that he would wear on the outside of his armor for everyone to see, to show how madly in love he was with her. He even declared himself her loyal heart. How cute is that? They just had such a cute, sweet relationship. And like I mentioned earlier, Henry really loved to spend the money that his father had carefully saved. So that's part of why the people really liked him, is he was finally starting to spend money and spoil the people. He had decadent parties, huge parties. He also made sure that him and his wife were always dressed in the absolute finest clothing, jewelry, and had the nicest furnishings. Now I mentioned that they had feasts and food and parties, okay? I want to specifically talk about the food because when I read this, my jaw literally dropped. So, often, and I mean often, their meals consisted of 7. Yeah, that's right. 7 courses. And each of those courses had up to 20 different dishes. 20 different dishes! I have had a 3-course meal once or twice in my life, and that was way too filling. And that was like 1 dish per course. Can you imagine 7 courses with 20 different dishes to pick from? Now, I want you to keep that in the back of your mind as we continue this story, because this is how he ate all the time. And he was very athletic, so he needed his energy. But 7 courses with 20, it's just crazy. In January of 1510, 7 months after their wedding, the queen actually would fulfill her duty to provide an heir to the throne. She gave birth to their first child. Unfortunately, it was a stillborn baby girl. And this was very disappointing, since the queen's only job is to provide an heir for Henry. And exactly a year later, in 1511, Catherine finally fulfilled her duty and gave birth to a son, Prince Henry. But he only survived for 2 months. Now, this was a devastating loss, and it was followed by another stillbirth in 1513, and then another son that only lived for a short amount of time in 1515. But despite all of their losses and the inability to provide an heir, Catherine and Henry were still really strong together and still very in love. And Henry was willing to be patient, and he was so understanding with Catherine and her struggles, and just like, you know what, I love you. It's going to be fine. We'll be fine. Now, remember, at this point in history, the mortality rate for babies was so high that even noble women often had up to 14 children and only ended up with a few that actually survived. So this means at this point in time, they had a lot of faith that Catherine was still going to be able to produce an heir at some point. So Henry was fine giving her plenty of time to produce that heir. Now, during his reign, Henry also forgave a lot of debtors and built bridges with royals that had not liked his father, and they couldn't help but like Henry and form alliances with him just because he was just such a genuinely good guy. And I know what you're thinking. This is horrible humans in history. I keep telling you, you gotta be patient. Just wait. It gets worse, I promise. Now, remember how I said that Henry was very loyal to the Pope? Well, the reason he actually... Rewind. I skipped a part. Sorry. So he actually wanted to start a conquest. It had been a while since England had gained any new territory or anything. So Henry decided that he wanted to go off to invade France. And he loved and trusted his wife so much that he left Catherine in charge as his regent. And I'll tell you what, she kicked butt while he was gone. So this is what I was saying a couple seconds ago. He was so loyal to the Pope. That's actually why he went to France originally, is because the Pope asked him to come and help fight France. Now, this is crazy to me, and I don't know how many people know this or are aware, but popes used to have so much power that they actually had armies that they could command. It was basically like they controlled an entire country and had armies. And the Pope was currently fighting against France, and Henry had been looking for an excuse to expand his nation. And when the Pope was like, "Hey, Henry, do you want to come and help me over here?" Henry was more than willing to be like, "Heck yes, Pope, I've got your back." So they were in France fighting. And while he was gone in France, another army tried to invade England. It was the Scottish army. And their invasion started literally 2 months after Henry had left for France. And Catherine, you know what? I love Catherine in this story. Can I just side note, sidebar? Catherine is a freaking rock star, and I love her. Just saying. Anyways, she was able to hold her own while Henry was gone. Like, for example, 17,000 out of the 40,000 Scots, including their king, would die in the battles that they were fighting against England that Catherine was in charge of. And the English lost 1,500 people of their 26,000 troops. That's how well they were being led in this fight. So Catherine, freaking rock star, while Henry is off in France fighting with the Pope. So, let me find my place. See, guys, I do read notes, just so you know. So I'm giving you the right information. So on June 28th, 1513, Henry would actually be ready to invade France for the first time in 100 years. It was the first time in 100 years that a British king would try and spread the empire to the continent. So 3 years later and 7 years into their marriage, they finally actually had a baby on February 18th, 1516. Princess Mary I of England was born. So while he was still, I mean, I guess he had come home to visit and that kind of thing. But their Mary I of England was their only child to live to adulthood. But you probably noticed she is a girl. And back then, that was not great. But for the time being, Henry continued to believe that Catherine would produce a male heir and treated Mary like a princess. He even had her educated like he would a son, which was very rare at the time. Most women were just educated on how to be a mother and a house, run the household or whatever. Henry called his daughter his pearl in the world. How cute is that? Like, he loved his daughter. However, by the 1520s, it was becoming more and more clear that a male heir was not coming. And since his wife seemed to be constantly pregnant, Henry started to take on multiple mistresses. Remember that at this point in history, they actually thought that having sex during pregnancy would harm the baby, and that a man's health was dependent on getting some action often. So it didn't mean he didn't love his wife. They just genuinely thought it was a healthy thing for him to get a release, and it was dangerous for her to participate because she was always pregnant. So It's still a little weird, but just so you know, in history, him taking on a bunch of mistresses wasn't necessarily because he did not love his wife anymore. So in June 1519, Elizabeth Blount, one of Catherine's own ladies-in-waiting, actually got pregnant by Henry and gave birth to a son. Now, can you imagine being Catherine, trying so hard to produce an heir, and your husband sleeps with one of your ladies-in-waiting and immediately has a son with him? Yeah. And he treated that son really, really well. Even though he ended up having a lot of other children out of wedlock, he treated this son the best out of all of those other children. Anyways, even though Henry never openly stated that he was bothered by Catherine's lack of producing an heir, it was obvious that it was now starting to bother him, because he had now proven that he could father a son. And Henry was now 27, and Catherine, she was getting up there in age. She was 33. So she was, really, really old. But her window was closing quickly to have children. And Catherine would actually only give birth one more time after this period, and it was to a stillborn daughter in 1518. And outside of his personal troubles of having a male heir, Henry's first 10 years of ruling were actually dominated with the theme of wanting to make England as powerful as France and Spain. And he expanded England's navy. Remember, he really wanted to have a really strong navy and was passionate about that. So he really, really focused in on that. And fun fact, in 1517, Martin Luther, I don't know if you've ever heard of Martin Luther, he began to publish papers against the Catholic Church that absolutely outraged Henry. So much so that he actually wrote and published a book in response to Martin Luther. For defending him, the Pope named Henry the Fide Defensor, or Defender of the Faith. And I know what you're thinking again, this guy does not seem that bad. But just hold on, the story is not over. It is this devotion to the Pope that would end up causing a lot of issues later in Henry's life. And eventually, he would doubt that the Pope actually had any power over the church at all. Spoilers. So, why did this happen? Why did he suddenly start doubting the Pope and his power? Oh, because he decided that he wanted to divorce his wife so he could marry another woman to produce an heir. And the Pope did not like this at all, since divorce was considered a sin at this time. Well, Henry had a plan around this, quote, divorce was a sin, because in the Bible, it says that if you marry your brother's widow, you are committing sin and that you will be cursed and unable to have children. So that is what he presented to the Pope as an argument to divorce Catherine, that they shouldn't have been allowed to get married in the first place, but the Pope had worded that, but he shouldn't have, because in the Bible it says that he shouldn't be able to marry his brother's widow. Now at this point, Henry is now in his 30s and was still trim and handsome because he was very athletic, still participating in many athletic activities, including his jousting. But Catherine was nearing her 40s at the time. I know, heaven forbid a woman get to her 40s, right? And she had actually gained quite a bit of weight, probably due to the 6 pregnancies in 9 years. And her husband's love and interest in her was being lost very quickly to another woman. And ironically, when Henry died, so it's really interesting that he was upset that she was getting old and she was gaining weight because, I don't know, she was pregnant a lot. Ironically, when he died, he was over 400 pounds. And remember those feasts? The seven rounds of food with 20 different plates each, like 400 pounds. he actually had to use a pulley system where they would lift him into his saddle because he was too heavy to get himself into the saddle. And they even had to use a type of wheelchair to wheel him around often because he was too tired to walk. So fun fact about that. So ironic that he would judge Catherine, the rock star, for that after everything she had done for him. Anyways, the woman that Henry was now in love with, her name was Anne Boleyn. She came to the courts in 1526 to be a lady-in-waiting to the queen and had quickly caught the eye of the king. She was young and beautiful with dark hair and dark eyes. She was witty and smart, and more importantly, she was in her mid-20s, so she was still able to make babies. The king fell really hard and really fast for Miss Anne Boleyn. Now, Anne knew exactly how to play a man. I will give her credit. She was very skilled, whether it was intentional or not. She figured out how to get into the king's head because the king begged her to be his mistress, and she absolutely refused, saying that she would only give up her virginity to her actual husband. And this drove the king crazy because it made him want her even more. That Anne Boleyn, she was a play, or she was just very true to her religion and would not give that up, which good for her if that's the case. So he did everything he could to try and get her to change her mind. He would get her expensive jewelry. He paid a ton of attention to her in the court, wrote her lovey-dovey letters. You name it, he tried it. And the people saw her as the other woman because the people loved their queen. The people loved Catherine. They had seen what she had done, and they absolutely loved her. And many people think that she encouraged the behavior from the king. But actually, there's some proof that she didn't want this attention from the king. In fact, she fled the royal courts in 1527 to try and escape his eye and escape everything to do with him, but it didn't work. It just made him want her even more. They had a full 7 years of courtship while Henry was married to Catherine, and they were very open about it in court. In the 8th year of their courtship, he finally appealed to the Pope for a divorce. He told the Pope that he had overreached his authority by allowing him to marry Catherine, and that is why he had been able to have any sons, because their whole marriage was a sin. So he blamed the Pope for Catherine's inability to get pregnant because it shouldn't have happened because it was a sin. Whatever. Total baloney. What a jerk. That's what I think. Anyways, his appeals took years, but eventually Henry had enough and decided that the Pope didn't actually have any power to make all the decisions about the church. So he started his own church. Now, do you remember our friend Thomas Cromwell? Did I mention him yet? He was an advisor to Henry VIII, one of his favorite advisors, in fact. And he was heavily involved in convincing the king and the parliament to create a series of acts declaring the king the head of the new church. And he was a yes man. I will tell you that right now. He would do anything that the king asked, and he had the ear of the king. And being a yes man to the king would actually come back to haunt Cromwell, which we'll talk about a little bit later. So by doing this, the king declared that all the monasteries needed to close and all the money within was now his. This made him the richest king ever, which was lucky for him since he had actually used all of the other money to fight France. He was broke, so it was super convenient that he could now rob all the churches for his own benefit. How great! So as you can see, he's starting to take that slight turn that we all look for in these horrible humans. But with his new church and new church leaders, he could do whatever he wanted. So he officially divorced Catherine, who tragically would die only 2 years later after the divorce. Now, Henry wanted a whole week after he waited a whole entire week after his divorce before he got remarried to Anne Boleyn. And the Pope actually excommunicated Henry. So, you see that bromance ends pretty quickly right here. But at this point, Henry had stopped caring what the Pope thought, and the Pope lost all of the following of King Henry, because not only did he lose King Henry, but he lost King Henry's people. And this is the beginning of Henry's turn towards the dark side. Like I said, it always happens. You just gotta wait for it. Power, I tell you what, it corrupts pretty heavily. So back to Henry taking over all the churches. He dissolved over 200 small monasteries between 1535 and 1536. And then between 1538 to 1540, he got rid of the remaining bigger churches across the land. So many of the civilians across the country did not agree with Henry and would speak out against Henry's push away from the church. And Henry did not like this. And before I go any further, I feel like we need to talk about something really important. An event that happened in January of 1536. At the age of 44, Henry was still participating in his favorite sport, jousting, when he took a nasty fall off of his horse. It was so bad that he was actually unconscious for 2 hours. I don't know if you guys know much about traumatic brain injuries. This is something I learned about in my undergraduate program. But being unconscious for 2 hours is not a good sign. That is not great. So on top of this traumatic brain injury that I am positive he suffered, he also had a severe injury to his leg that would actually cause an ulcer that would never heal and actually leaked and oozed smelly grossness for the rest of his life. Like, I have heard it was very nasty, and like sometimes it would be so gross that there would be maggots in it. Like, oh, yeah, really, really gross. Anyway, so he suffered this severe injury, and the head injury, though, that's the most important part of this that we need to talk about. It's believed that when he had this severe head injury, it actually altered his personality, which is very common in traumatic brain injuries. Doesn't always happen, but it can. People will come back and recover from the traumatic brain injury, but be kind of a different person. And this was the case for Henry. He became much more ruthless and much more paranoid. Where have we heard that before? It's like, if you're in power, you have to be paranoid. Like, that's how it has to go. So not to mention, on top of the paranoia and the ruthlessness, he became much, much more violent. Gone was the young, handsome, charismatic king that everyone had loved. He had been taken over by a ruthless dictator. And this is also when Henry began to gain all of his weight, because he could no longer participate in any of the sports. But he kept eating those huge banquet meals like he had before. So with his personality shift in mind, he was now dealing with rebellious citizens all throughout the land. Well, what is the best way to deal with rebellious people? Well, obviously, it's to kill them and put them to death. Obviously. Well, at least that's what King Henry thought. One of his first victims was actually his second wife, Anne Boleyn. Her first crime was she was not able to produce an heir. She produced a female heir, Princess Elizabeth. Her second crime, which many historians actually believed were trumped up charges made by Thomas Cromwell, you know, that guy, the yes man. She was accused of being unfaithful to the king, and that is a big no-no. He can have as many mistresses as he wants, but she was not allowed to have any extra lovers. So, because it was rumored that she had slept around and was unfaithful to the king, she was beheaded in 1536. And he would quickly marry her lady-in-waiting, Jane Seymour, who finally produced a male heir that he had been wanting. But unfortunately, Jane died during birth due to complications with the birth. But Prince Edward would survive. So, Henry finally had his male heir thanks to Jane Seymour, his third wife. Well, Anne Boleyn was the first victim of his execution. Jane died of natural causes, but Anne Boleyn would be one of the first of many victims executed, including Thomas Cromwell. He was actually brought up on charges of treason and executed. What caused his downfall, you might ask? This is so hilarious to me, okay? This is what happened. He brought King Henry, his third wife, Anne of Cleves. So initially, Thomas showed Henry a picture of Anne of Cleves, and Henry was like, she's gorgeous. I will totally marry her. And everyone's like, yeah, she's really pretty. You're going to really like her. And so they brought Anne, and they basically got married the day she got there. And when Henry saw her, he was ticked. It was like the first catfish he'd ever experienced. Her picture did not match the real thing, and he was mad. So their marriage was the shortest of them all. He divorced her very quickly and executed Thomas Cromwell, also because they believed that he was committing treason, but it was mostly because he was mad about the wife thing. So don't make Henry mad about the wives. Henry wasn't a boring executor either. I know a lot of people hear about the beheading thing, but he used other ways to execute people. So beheading wasn't the only tool in his tool belt. He also would hang them. He burned them at the stake. He boiled them and would draw and quarter them. If you don't know what being drawn and quartered is, well, I am not going to describe it here because it sounds like the worst way to die, and it is horrific. So that is all I will say about that. You can look it up if you want. I don't recommend it. Anyways, he killed as many as 72,000 people, basically wiping out any former supporters of the Catholic Church in England. This would cause the Roman Catholic versus Protestant wars throughout England for the years to come. This was a back and forth that continued happening throughout the next few years after Henry VIII was gone. So, after quickly divorcing Anne of Cleves, because, she must have been fugly or something, I don't know. That's what he thought. He would marry a young, beautiful woman named Catherine Howard. Unlike Anne Boleyn, though, Catherine legitimately cheated on the king. So obviously she was put to death pretty quick, but her lovers were also executed. One of them was beheaded, and he got off lucky because the other was hung and then drawn and quartered while still living. So, super great. His final marriage was actually to Catherine Parr, and she would outlive him only because they were married 4 years before he actually died. So she was lucky to marry him in the smelly, gross, ulcer leg, extremely unwell and unhealthy stage of his life because it probably saved her life. So at the age of 55, King Henry would die in the early hours of January 28th, 1547. Prince Edward, at the age of 9, would become the crowned king, and finally King Henry's whole life goal and life's ambition to have a male heir on the throne had come to pass. Ironically, his son would die in 1553, and Henry's 2 daughters would end up becoming the first queens of England. So the girls actually came out for the win on this one because their brother, or half-brother, I would say, ended up passing away. So, King Henry VIII was a horrible human in history this week because not only is he famous, well, right now I feel like he's only famous because of his 6 wives, but because he killed so many people. 72,000 people were put to death just because he decided that he didn't like his religion anymore and he was going to force his people to agree with his religion and participate in that religion. It's just crazy to me. And nowadays, what we know of King Henry VIII, or what we remember, is the story of his wives. There's a play about it. It's a musical. If you haven't heard the song, I would sing it for you, but nobody wants that, I promise. But that is what he's remembered for. How he divorced, beheaded, and his wife died. And then he divorced the next one, beheaded the next one, and the last one survived. And I think it's more important that he's known for the tyrannical way in which he forced people to either join the religion and stop complaining about him or die. Those were the options. So he was a ruthless dictator, and I am always curious when I read his story and talk about him, because I studied him quite a bit in my graduate program. What would have happened if he did not have that traumatic brain injury? Would he still have become as ruthless or as horrible? I don't know. We'll never know, actually. But it is interesting to think about what would have changed in history if he would have actually been wise and not jousted like his father wanted him to. You always listen to your parents, right? They're always right, right? Anyways, so today, our horrible human in history was Henry VIII. Thanks again, Holly, for the recommendation. Again, if you guys have any recommendations of horrible humans in history that you want to hear about, please let me know. I'm happy to talk about them. I'll do the research so you don't have to. Our next episode, though, we are going to be talking about a famous kidnapping that happened here in the good old United States that ended with the murder of the 2-year-old son of one of the most famous men at the time, Charles Lindbergh. If that name sounds familiar, it should be ringing a bell. I'm not going to tell you why until this next episode. But we are going to be talking about the Lindbergh kidnapping and the man behind it all, Bruno Richard Hauptmann. So, if you're liking these creepy stories and these horrible people from history, make sure you're liking and subscribing. Make sure you share this with anyone you know that would enjoy this kind of information or just these stories in general. And I will see you guys, I was going to say next week, but stay tuned. The next episode happens right now.